Well, hello, and welcome to Patristica. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Marcello Zanfra, who is the Professor of Classics at Sao Paulo University, and as always, my colleagues Mark Bilby and Markus Vincent. And I'm really grateful that Marcello's joined us today for two reasons. Number one, because we're going to be talking about one of the what I call sexy early church fathers in Jerome. And also from a slightly different take, we were discussing before the podcast some of the methodologies that we're taught as we go through the university system and some of the benefits I think that classicists like Marcello here bring to our field and the critical eye that they can cast that those who are brought up with the training I have weren't naturally given. And so with all that out of the way, Marcello, why don't you just introduce for us before we start the person of Jerome? Who was he and what do we have from him?
Well, okay, let's go. Jack, thanks for the invitation. Markus, thank you for being here and for inviting me. It's a huge opportunity. I'm deeply honored. And discussing Jerome, it's always an honor. It's a famous guy. It's one of the most popular writers in the patristics. And usually he's known even by the common public, no specialist, because he's always quoted as the Bible translator. That's not a lie. It's a truth, but it's more complicated than that. As always, as everything is in patristics. So Jerome is one of the church fathers. That's obvious, but sometimes it's fun to say how this authority has been constructed and how strange some moments can be. Every time someone asks me about Jerome, I like to quote two different stories or anecdotes to illustrate how different he was seen in time. Well, when in beginning of the last century, the Pope Leo the 13th, just before our actual Pope Leo, decided to make an academic school in Croatia. And what was the reason? Why can this happen? Well, Dalmatia, the place where Jerome was born, usually is considered as a place in actual Croatia. But when the Pope tried to do that, he said that he was starting a college called the Croatian Jeronian College. And this name caused a huge problem because other regions from the originally Illyrian people claimed that Jerome was born in his country, in their countries, like Serbia or Montenegro. And when he had to retrain that and change the name, take the Croatian away and say Jeronian College. So at this point, last century, for example, the countries were fighting for, say, they were the homeland from Jerome. But if you go a little bit more back in time to the 16th century, we had another story about a different pope, Sixtus V, saying that when he was walking through the Vatican, he saw a painting of Jerome in the desert, holding a rock and pressing it against his chest in a penitent posture. And the legend says that the Pope, looking at this picture of Jerome, said, "That's a good thing you were doing that, because otherwise it would be impossible to claim you as a saint." What the Pope said, of course, was that Jerome had so many sins that unless he was a penitent person, it was impossible to claim him as a saint. What I'm trying to say by these two stories, Jack, is that Jerome is a controversial figure. And today we can see him as a saint, as the Bible translator, as a huge intellectual, and he's of that. I'm not denying it, of course. But he's too a controversial figure. He lived in a controversial time, and rhetorically controversial time. So, discussing more specifically, Jerome was born in 374, and has died probably in 420. So he's a perfect guy for the patristic time, the 4th and 5th century uh, for our era. And Jerome has some interesting aspects in his biography. As long as we know, and he himself tell us that in his letters, he was born in Dalmatia, or Dalmatia in Latin, and it was a place far, far away from the city of Rome. Many languages were spoken there, and Jerome was born in a region that, in his 7th letter, he says that it's a bad place. It's an ignorant place. People usually only are worried about eating and just keep living, no study at all. So he painted us a bad picture about his homeland. We can see here, of course, he's trying to promote himself, uh, like he was some sort of self-made man, or like like we say in Latin, homo novus, like Cicero was, for example, fighting for his spot in under the sun, in the sun of Rome, of course. But Jerome says something interesting too about his family. His family has some good financial situation, but most important, he says that he was born in a Christian home, and this is really important to him. His mother was a Christian, his father was a Christian, and the metaphor he used to that is saying that he was fed with Christian milk since he was born. And that's for him, interesting for him. He was born in such a distant place, but inside his family, he was a Christian since he was born, or even before he was born. And Jerome was a guy who enjoyed studying, as far as you can believe in his letters. And when he was about 12 years old, he moved to Rome. He moved to the capital city, Caput Mundi, as the Roman used to say, to study again. And here's a really important thing, because when he moved to Rome, he started studying under Aelius Donatus, and he was one of the most famous and important grammars in the Roman world. And when he started studying there, he got a strong contact with the classics, with poets like Virgil, Terence. He enjoyed so much. We cannot forget, for example, that Donatus wrote books about Terence, about Jerome, sorry, about Virgil, like there were commentary in Latin about the authors. So Jerome had a strong memory. He was really good at it. So he claims that reading once or twice those texts, he already has memorized them. He has such good memory. And he was a Christian since he was born. But there is another important difference here. Uh, in times of Jerome, people were baptized later. The Vatican started to persecute this practice, but in his times it was common. Jerome was baptized when he was more than 20 years old. It was a later baptism. And at this point, he says, starts to directing all his energies, all his intellectual abilities to the Christian works, for writing and for teaching, and trying to have some sort of career in the Catholic Church. Well, another important thing, just to not speak too much about what you're asking me, is that Jerome was a good traveler. He went for most of the parts of the known world back that time. He spent most of his life in Berlin, where he was in a monastery. Then he traveled back for Greece, for example, and he never stopped studying and making social relations, social connections in these spots. And his life in the East, it's a really important part of his job. And just to make an important point here, Jerome is important in very many aspects, but one of the most is his defense of the Hebraica Veritas, or the Hebrew truth. Jerome claimed that you can only understand the Gospels or the Holy Scriptures in general if you can read the original language. Jerome was important for the philology too, if you can say that way. he was a strong defensor in a moment where that was not a common idea. That his authority, his contribution was that he was the only one, or one of the few ones able to do that, to understand the Holy Scriptures in their original language. So he was a man who knew Latin, of course, Chaldean, to understand the Book of Daniel, and who knew Greek, who knew Hebrew, and that's why in the Catholic Church, for example, he's the saint and who protects the translators, the teachers, the professors, and I think that's the what I can start telling about him. He was a kind of self-made man. He was a strong defensor of the the contact with the original text. That's why we came to Vulgata, for example, the translation of the Bible, and that he was a controversial figure, mostly because he was an angry person. If you can read all of his texts, he was a very irascible man. And that's maybe the reason why the first pope, the Pope Sistus, that I mentioned before, was thankful because he was a penitent guy. Because if he didn't ask for forgiveness, well, he made lots of sins. It would be hard for having him as a saint. And most of them, he was an angry person. Augustine, for example, was kind of shocked when they started changing letters for the first time. And I have this feeling that Augustine was feeling, well, why is he treating me like that? Why is he so angry at me in his letters? That was important part of him. He was a polemic lover. He's called sometimes a master of polemics, the fight in the texts.
That's really interesting, because I think that often when we learn about figures like Jerome and Augustine, their personalities are sometimes slightly whitewashed. That because they're canonical saints, particularly if you come from a religious background and training, you're taught to revere them. And we should, in some sense, have great respect for these figures because they are clearly influential and important. But the idea of Jerome as a controversial or an angry man, I think, is one that would not be in the minds of most of our listeners who have learned about Jerome in the past. Before we get onto his texts proper, and I'm really interested to dig under those a little bit, and I know you've got some slides for us as well.
Sure.
You mentioned one of his social networks, as it were, Augustine. Just really interested to sort of plot him in terms of who were his influences and who did he go on to influence. What's his sort of his line, therefore, of where does he come from and who does he make impact on?
It's an amazing question, Jack. Well, I think I can say again that for his non-religious reformation, Donatus was pretty important. He got a strong knowledge about the classics because of Donatus. But discussing theology or ideas like that, we have to talk about Origen. Origen was one of his most influential writers. Even if you consider that controversial around his name, that happened later. But before the council, the Vatican declared Origen as heretical author, Jerome was a huge enthusiast of his work. And in this sense, we can say that he was not the only one. Sometimes Origen was considered the 30th apostle. He was a confessor. He almost died for not denying the Christian faith. So Jerome loved one part of Origen's works. And this will cause him serious problems later. When Origen is considered an heretical author, Jerome is in a bad situation because he was such an enthusiast. He translated Origen so many times. We can discuss this too, but just to make it clear, Jerome made translations from Origen's homilies. Jerome quotes Origen many times, and I think that Origen is really important to him in his way of dealing with the texts. As a guy who read, interpret, and make textual corrections. In this sense, Jerome sometimes wanted to be like Origen. And I'm not saying this by myself. I'm quoting some of his commentaries, Jeronian commentaries. So Argent is a strong and important figure to him. About the influence, it's an interesting part too. Jerome had this some dream. I'm not talking about the famous dream in the Epistle 22. And a personal dream where he wanted to be a moral guide to everyone. When he was even in the letter exchanging, he was explaining to people how to behave, how to be a proper Christian, or explaining passages from the Holy Scriptures. And this made him really close to the women in Rome, the rich and well-related women in Rome. For example, like Paula, Saint Paula for the Catholicism, Eustochium, Marcella, all of them were their students, were learning with him. And among other Christian writers, Jerome had a strong connection with, or a strong influence over Augustine, but not always in the quiet sense, in the pacific sense. Sometimes they were fighting, but Jerome is such a fighting man that he unites with someone else because they wanted to fight with a different person. So what brought Augustine and Jerome together was that they were fighting the Pelagianism later when Augustine was starting his career. So it's amazing how Jerome enjoys fighting. When he starts fighting with Augustine, he can join Augustine and fight a different person. And the Vulgate mostly, it's an important part here because just to answer your question more properly, Jack, the Bible translation was a process initiated, if you can believe in Jerome letters, by Pope Damasus. Damasus asked him to make a new version for the Bible, and not only to translate from Greek or from Hebrew, but just even to uh, see what were the best texts already in Latin circulating in Rome or circulating among the Christianity. And he starts his job doing that. But when Damasus was alive, Jerome was fine. Damasus protected him. But when Damasus died, the situation started getting bad for him because presenting a new Bible translation was a really courageous and temporary action. Mostly because they already have one version from the Bible. We cannot forget here, for example, that the Roman were always, or most of the time, bilingual. They knew Greek and they knew Latin. So they already had the Septuaginta, the Greek version from even the Old Gospels and from the Old Testament. So presenting a new version was considered for many persons, including Augustine here, a necessary task. And more important than that, Jerome was indirectly saying that the Septuaginta version had errors. And that's a huge accusation because Septuaginta was, according to the myth, according to the story, written by 72 wise men closed in their cells, and they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So they present a new text with no strong errors or bad connections between them. But Jerome started pointing that there were errors. There were missing lines. There were wrong interpretations, and it was a courageous, or I say again, or even suicide attitude for criticizing a version like that. Damasus protected him. Damasus, according to Jerome, asked him to do that. But well, what is Jerome pointing here? That the Holy Spirit can fail, or the seven wise are not that wise. They made wrong assumptions, wrong translations. So Jerome had to defend himself so many times. It's almost boring. How many times he tries to say that I'm an innocent guy. I love Septuaginta just as you do. I'm not the wrong one here. If you or who is watching us have a version of this Vulgata. This is a Brazilian publisher, but it's published equally in every country. We have the preface from Jerome to each translation book. And if you can believe in him, oh my God, he was one of the most hated people in the period. Only because he dared to make a new translation. He dared to question the wise man that made the first translation from the Greek. So even Augustine felt that it was not necessary. Later, he started reading the Vulgata and started enjoying it. He felt that it was a good version. It was a philological appropriate version. They have this relation more strongly settled. But I think that Jerome has this more strong influence in the next centuries. When we study, for example, the Renaissance, and we go Erasmus of Rotterdam, for example, Erasmus was a huge reader of Jerome, and he had the same idea that he had, and that is, you have to know philology. If you claim to be a Christian doctor or a Christian intellectual, you must be able to read the original texts. Even in our times nowadays, in 2025, we have a similar connection with that. Who translated my version of the Bible? Did he translate from the original language, or there was an intermediation between them? Jerome had succeeded to put in our minds this feeling. How much this person understands of the original language? I think that's the most important part, even for the Scholastic before and for the Renaissance. Like when Erasmus was publishing his version of the Bible, he had to deal with Jerome's version. He had to do with the Vulgata. And Erasmus, just like Jerome, took an courageous attitude, that is to correct Jerome about his translation and about his interpretation of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Is that a good answer? Anything else?
No, I think that's a great answer. One of the things that the words you use there is polemic. And it stands to reason that those who are usually angry men often are polemical. I can think of many who are polemical on the world stage, even to this day. I just wonder to what extent the Vulgate was a polemic text. I mean, you mentioned in one of the email correspondences that we had that it was polemical, and also some of his translation methods. In what way was the Vulgate sort of polemical, and in what way was his methods an issue? Why was Augustine against it? Apart from the reasons you've already suggested, obviously. Again, I think you might have a slide for this, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, one of the last ones, maybe. Oh.
There's beautiful pictures of Origin. Jerome, sorry, as we go.
Can we discuss the pictures?
Of course. Why don't we do that first? Because then we don't have to skip past them. Why do we do that first? That's a good place.
I start with the pictures just to make a connection with that story about the Pope in the 16th century. And we have somehow it matches with your question about who Jerome is and his influence. Well, Jerome will start being the protagonist of many paintings in the 16th and 17th century, what you call the Renaissance and the Baroque time period. And we have some very clear lines of painting him. First of one is Jerome as an intellectual, and then a hard-working intellectual. Caravaggio, for example, here paints Jerome writing. He's a saint already. You can see the aureola over his head. But the idea of Jerome as an intellectual and a hard-working intellectual, it's really common in the tradition, Jeronian tradition. But there is a thing here that is important, that Jerome is always painting alone. And it's not true. That's not true historically, because Jerome usually didn't write with his own hands most of what he did. Jerome mostly had a notary, secretarians who wrote what he was quoting. And when I was in the NAPS, I got an interesting question about it. Jerome had a good memory, and he was telling his secretaries to write what he was thinking. But how would he quote the classics? Was the question that I was invited to think about. Because he loves to put small verses from Virgil, from Terence, from Plautus, from Persius, and he had to say it aloud. Did he respect the metric? Did he respect the intonation? It's just, of course, a, a free imagination exercise, but we can make this confusion. Jerome usually represented as a law man, as a man writing a law, but actually he was surrounded by people working for him. The notarius in Latin, the plural notari, the secretarians that wrote his papers. There's an excellent book about it. I will show, and he's a Brazilian author too. The book technique, according to Jerome, it's Paulo Evaristo Arnes. This book is made. It's his thesis in Sorbonne about what we can see in Jerome about the way he wrote, about the paper, about the textual conditions in his times, and textual classifications. It's a study about passages in his text where he talks or discusses about paper, about ink, and about how hard it was to send a message back in his time, and how this influence made a huge influence on him about what he would write and what he wouldn't because of that. If you can make me a favor, show please, Jack, the next picture. Here is Jerome studying again. He was writing in Caravaggio and his in Sommeren's Reason. Always lots of books, always contrasting different texts. And I think it's an important detail here. It's not by accident that Jerome is painting with 2 or 3 books over his lap or over his table. Jerome loved to make comparison, to make textual comparisons between the Bible versions, between Origen's commentaries and his own. He was even accused of being a compilator, that he was not creative enough to write his own ideas, so he had to gather together many ideas for other persons because he himself wouldn't be able to do so. And there is another important thing here. Jerome is most of the time naked or just wearing this red robe here. Most of his body is always naked, and I think that there is a message here about his life too. Jerome was a strong defensor of the asceticism, like he was the human being should deny the pleasures, the eating, the drinking, and live poorly, live with modesty. But there's another important thing here that is in the back of this painting, we have an open landscape, suggesting that Jerome is not in the study room like he's represented so many times, but here he is in a cave, and the opening of the cave is in the back of the painting. And this have a strong connection with Jerome's life. When I said in the beginning, he moved to East for some time. His first important stop was in Antioch. When he went to the desert, it was something kind of common back at that time. Just like Jesus went to the desert in the 3 first Gospels, and it was tempted by Satan. It was common for the priests or for the religious man to went to the desert and try to experience what it was like to be under such extreme needs, being hungry, being thirsty, and if he was able to resist for the body demands. Jerome had a time in the desert, and he was really proud of that. He always was bragging how he survived, how he was a different man after that time in the desert, how that changed his life, and how he resisted temptations. One of those temptations, and that was when my research gets, it's the temptation of the classics, the temptation of reason, those texts so well written with so many resources, many effects, rhetorical effects. And he was, after the time in the desert, he was able to forget all of that and start feeling better about the Christian simplicity. That was the most important part for him. Can you see the next pictures, please? Here it's our penitent Jerome in the desert, like I said, meditating, crying, asking for forgiveness, and receiving that, if you can believe in this. You can see later we can read the passage in the letters when he speak about this time. But that's another common image of Jerome. He's written his time in this, or his time having asking for mercy and to connect with the soul and not with the body. Can you see the next one, please? Here's the picture, maybe, that the Pope saw and noted Jerome pressing a rock against his chest in this contrictive position, asking for forgiveness. Again, Jerome, it's in the desert, asking for forgiveness. Can you see the next, please? Here, there's an important legend here too. It's an important thing to say here. Jerome was acclaimed a saint before the formal process from the Catholic Church, and he was acclaimed a saint. It's different from what the Catholic Church does nowadays. That is to have a strong investigation process, trying to see miracles, confirm miracles, and he was acclaimed a saint. And this is one of his legendary miracles. When the lion came too close to him in the Antioch desert, asking for help. Of course, no one knew that it was asking for help because it all tried running away. But Jerome felt calm, went to the lion, and saw that he was with spines in his leg, and started taking it away. The lion was so grateful that he almost said thank you, but with his body, he left Jerome, and it was kind of a miracle. He was able to help a lion. There are lots of interpretations about the scene, why the lion is important. Of course, lion is associated with Christ. And later, Jerome is calling the lion too, because of his posture, his aggressive posture, his combative posture. When someone is it's aggressive like Jerome, you can say two things. For one of them is that he's a bad-humored person. Other one is that he's courageous, brave, and combative. That was the way that his biography chose to end. Can you see the next one? Here, it's important image too. Okay, my chart is with a problem here, sorry. Here, Jerome is in the desert again, and he's visited by an angel. This idea of an inspiration, of course, you can say, angelos in Greek means messenger. And in this scene, we are seeing inspired Jerome. Caravaggio painted Jerome on his own. But here, Renis painted him as an inspired person. And at this point, we can discuss the Vulgate, for example. How would Jerome defend himself about these accusations? Well, first of all, he's inspired too. If the Septuaginta was inspired, he's inspired too. He's doing a sanctus job, as he wrote in his letters. So if you want to translate a holy text, an inspired text, you had to be inspired too. So Jerome claims his position to him. He's not doing because of himself. He's not doing because only someone asked. It was a job for the Christianity. It was a job for the mankind. And for that, he needed the divine inspiration. And that's where you see in here. There are other arguments, but the inspiration, the divine inspiration, is one of the most important. He was inspired too. And you can discuss the Vulgate again, like you asked, Jack, because of his methods. Can we see that passage, please, where he's discussing how he wanted to interpret?
Which one is it?
Let me find here, please. Just a minute.
Can I just ask? Can I just come in?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen these wonderful pictures in the art historical pictures, and one of the questions that comes to me when I see this kind of art historical hagiography, why do we have this kind of insistence on Jerome, and hence on making or writing almost or painting a hagiography of the Vulgate. Is it a kind of canonization of the Vulgate with divine inspiration of this text, of which we know, I mean, by the claim, whether true or wrong, we might discuss today, that Jerome is the author of this translation of the Bible. That puts him in a weak position in one sense, because it's a novel translation. So unfortunately, it's not going back to the apostles. I think we have little claim that the apostles spoke both Latin and Greek. I mean, Pentecost, of course, allowed them to speak all languages. So we could have had a history which is written differently, by which one could say, oh, it's the apostles' work. But then we have this clash between what we call the old Latin translations, which we might have referred back to the apostles, but that's usually not done. So we have a certain abyss and hiatus between the apostolic tradition, and then comes a young tradition, a Damasus tradition, a Jerome tradition. And now, of course, we are squeezed, because there are a few hundred years missing, and still we have to claim that the Holy Spirit, even in the 4th century, particularly linked with Damasus, and with this strange bloke of Jerome, who is not very much liked by quite a number of people, and then to infer that the Holy Spirit sometimes and the angels come to a bloke like Jerome. So that's an interesting tension, I think, to see how hagiography tries to work around those historical issues. Or what's your take on that?
That's amazing, Markus. That's why Jerome is so interesting, because he was
always been for me.
But his arguments were not all of them under the sign of divine inspiration. And your question is excellent in one of the points that Jerome always thought about. Well, who is the authority here? Septuaginta was the closest authority, but Jerome was making a new translation. He was presenting a new version. How can we say that the new is better than the old? That's what comes to his mind and his argument, and that's something I try to prove in my thesis and in this new book, is that Jerome was saying that he was not that that version was not so new, and the problem is his new version was in fact a reconnection with the old truth. What happened was, after the original written, the text manuscripts were missing, were losing their connection to the first truth, the translation of the translation of the translation, and even with some parts of the text missing because of paper conservation. And Jerome had a strong argument. I respect Septuaginta. I do respect them, but in our times, it is not working anymore. And first argument, that it was not a translator's fault. The Holy Spirit was there. They were good interpreters, and they chose to undercut some parts of the text. They were under Ptolemy in Alexandria. So they didn't want to show the whole truth for this king. So they kind of produced the cipher text, hiding informations and hiding part of the mystery, the holy mystery. But I think that his most strong argument is that, I respect Septuaginta, but I respect Christ even more. And if sometimes I have to choose between Septuaginta and the word of the Christ, I choose Christ, of course. What he's trying to say is that he reads the New Testament and realized that sometimes Jesus quotes passages that are not in the Old Testament Septuagint. So what's the problem here? Is the Christ lying? Obviously, it's not. Christ doesn't lie. If he's quoting something that an old prophet said, and they go to my text, and it's not there, we have a problem here. And the problem, obviously, is not with the Christ. So he writes this in his letters. He writes this in some of his preface to the Vulgata, saying that if Jesus said that this happens, I went to Septuaginta, I can't find this passage, but I went to the original Hebrew manuscripts, and the passage is there. Well, it means that I have to translate it again. I have to present a new version. I have to put it in circulation again. And I think that's a really ingenious way of thinking. Jerome knows he's presenting a new version. What he can do for give some authority to it, he says that this version is not new. It's just a new connection with someone that was lost. And if you cannot be angry at me, be angry at the Christ. Christ quotes a passage. The passage is not in Septuaginta. Obviously, the text is wrong. You can fight with Christ. He's always right. That's the way he posed himself. So Jerome acts like he was under a mission of presenting the old truth in a new way. Look, it's not a new truth. It's the old truth, the only old truth, but that it was lost, was disconnected from us. So that's what he's trying to do. His new job, actually, according to him, it's extremely traditional. It's a way of reconnecting with the tradition.
It's interesting, and it makes the thing a bit even more complex, that the so-called truth of Christ is, of course, also based on a translation. And again, I think it is the claim that also the New Testament, let alone the problem with the Old Testament, but the New Testament, of course, was also being reproduced and translated again. And so we have the whole issue of whether or not Jerome translated, as he claims, also the Gospels, and let alone the even more complex problem, whether or not he translated Paul's letters. But that might be a question which we touch a bit later.
Just to make a new comment, Markus, and there is another important thing here about Jerome, is that his way of conceiving what an author is. Jerome is not only a translator, but he's a textual organizer. So he has this point for him, that is, he says so, of course. He's able to understand if that was a true Paul's writing, a true John's writing, according to the style. And it's really important. If we make a quick connection here, when Michel Foucault wrote What is an Author? Qu'est-ce que c'est un auteur? He quoted Jerome, because according to Foucault, Jerome was one of the first to understand that author is not something outside of the text, but created by it. So you can see styles, formulas, ways of writing that you can understand as a proper text, not an apocryphal one. Jerome uses this idea for him. Use this idea that he can say what is truth and what's true text and what is a false text, because he's studied so much the author's style that every time that passage sounds weird or inappropriate, he would understand it and say that it was not a true version, a true passage. So we have to add this layer of understanding, that is, the way someone writes is important to Jerome, and he can use that for understand say what is true and what is false in Bible versions. Is that okay?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
that's great. I'm just conscious of time. Why don't you take us just a little bit into some of the texts that you've given us? I noticed there's a few different texts that you've got. I'm just really interested to know why these were some of the selections that you've pulled out in the plethora of material we have of Jerome.
Well, Jerome loves writing, right? So it takes their whole life to read all he's done. But, well, first of all, the letter number 22, it's extremely important. I think that even who never studied Jerome read at some point these epistles. And in this letter, he's telling about that so much famous dream about he being judged for all his love for the pagans. And there's so many important things here. First of all, it's a letter sent to Eustochium, talking about virginity. In the previous slide, there is a painting where Jerome is teaching to Paula and Eustochium about that social relation in Rome that I spoke to you. And this letter is dedicated to her. And it's a strong defense of the virginity, of not getting married, not having the physical relations. And in this letter, and this letter was written in the desert, if you adopt the chronology in Jerome's life, he tells about himself, not the virginity in the sense of physics or a body, but intellectual virginity. And he's presenting himself as a penitent man. In this part, he tells to Sokin that she doesn't need to read the classics because a woman shouldn't make that reading. It's bad for her formation. So the virginity here is not only in the physical sense, as I was saying, it's also in the intellectual sense. Christ and Belial, Christian and pagans, are not to be mixed. It might be it can impress us, but if we can make some quick comparisons, we can realize that Jerome usually doesn't spend much time condemning the pagans. He doesn't have a huge work against the pagans like Athanasius had, or the first half of the City of God, for example, from Augustine, where it's almost against the pagans. Jerome, it's more delicate in this subject. And this can be really surprising, Jerome being delicate. But he tries sometimes to claim that you shouldn't keep reading the classics. And that's strange because he read a lot of them. So in the next slide, if you can see it, we can watch it, read it, sorry. We can see he presented himself like a penitent man. I was wrong, he says. I was wrong for loving the pagans so much and their reasons. Can we pass the next slide, please, Jack? I think that here he starts to talk about his own life, and he was making traveling. He was coming back for his house, and he was trying to get his books from Cicero and Plautus. It's important because these are two authors famous for their love for playing with the words, to adorn their text very much. And he writes there that he was asleep. He was awake nights and nights for reading those texts. He was sometimes so in love for this passion, this way of writing, this fantastic use of words and style, that when he started reading the scriptures, he was bored by their simplicity. And what he's trying to say is that he was the wrong one, of course, not the Holy Scriptures. And at this point, he falls asleep and he's dreaming, he's sick too, he's having a delirium. And in this delirium, he finds himself in the court. And can you see the next slide, please? There is this.
Can I just ask you, just
Sure.
going back, because you were saying he thought he it was his own fault.
Yeah.
I read this passage slightly differently, because he makes the point that it's to do with these blind eyes, yeah, cecit oculis non videbam. But then he says, "Oh, actually, no, it's not. It's not the fault of my blind eyes. It's the fault of the light." So if the light, from what I understand, if the light is a hidden light in a way, because the prophets that you read, they sound uncultured. I mean, well, you said boring. I would say it's horrible, right? Horribly barbaric. For somebody who is used to read Plautus, it is barbaric. One has to admit, yeah. And yet, the light in this barbaric literature doesn't shine through the literature. It's hidden behind the text. So whereas if you read Plautus, the light shines in your hand and you're delighted by the language and by what's being said. So it is not the humans or the readers' issue, I think, but it is the fact that in the Old Testament, yeah, the sense is not given by the literature itself. So that's the way I would read it.
Sure. I agree with your reading, Markus. I think it's so true that sometimes Jerome, when he's discussing translation methods, he says when we translate the Holy Scriptures, it's a different task. Even the order of the words, it's a whole mystery. So you have this truth beyond and above the reason. Like some, it's metaphorically, it's something like a jury that it's hidden, and in the pagans, in Plautus and Cicero, and that's important. The choose of authors he made, it's shining almost immediately because it's not a real and profound shining. Sure, I think I agree with you. I think it's possible too. It's a good reason. Yeah. So if we can read the next part when he's discussing his life in the court, and in his dream or in his revelation, we'll never know. Then suddenly my spirit was snatched away and prostrated before a judgment court, where there were so many and such strong lights coming from the radiant beings who were around me that I threw myself to the ground without daring to look up. Sounds like Plato's cave metaphor, right? Look at the shadows and can't stand the light. When they asked me about my condition, I answered that I was a Christian. But the one who presided over the court said, "That's a lie. You are Ciceronian, not a Christian. For there where your treasure is, there will your heart be." It's a quote from Matthew, right? I remained speechless before this, and between each lash he had ordered that I be flogged. The flame of my conscience charged me even more, chewing over this verse. Who will praise you in the depths? Can you see the next part, please, just to finish his dream? I then began to cry out in tears, "Have mercy on me, Lord, have mercy on me." And my words echoed amid the sound of its scourge. Finally, the spectators threw themselves at the feet of the presiding judge and begged him to forgive my youth and to give me the chance to make up for my error, but that I would be crucified if I ever returned at any time to read the works of the Gentiles. And I, pressed by such a situation, wanted to promise something even greater, and taking his name as a witness, said, "Lord, if I ever post or read the works of the ancients, it's because I have denied you." I was then dismissed, having sworn these words, and returned to the word of the surface. And since then, I have read the divine text with a great dedication, never showed in the reading of mortal texts. This was of the most famous passage from Jerome and from his time. And it caused so many discussions again about polemics again. When Jerome had the quarrel with Rufinus, for example, Rufinus accused him of loving the pagans very much, quoting them every time, even for ladies, something that Rufinus thought was incredibly bad. Then Jerome used this simple but good argument. He writes about Rufinus in his apology. Are you seriously taking so serious my dream? It was a dream. I was ill. I was having a delusion, and you were saying that I have to honor a vow that I made when I was dreaming. But in this point, he's presenting himself as living a revelation. But Jerome manipulated these things so many times, and at some point, this is a true revelation. At other points, it's just a dream, just a strange dream. Some scholars, for example, try to delimitate how many times we can find uh, allusions to the pagans after and before the dream, and that was inconclusive. Inconclusive. In the first years after the dream, the Alleg dream, he was quoting the pagans in the less times. After that, there was just irrelevance. And Jerome manipulates this with a really good idea. He said, I never vowed that I wouldn't quote the pagans again. I just said I won't ever read them again. And I didn't. and I made that true. And when people ask him, but do you really know all that by your memory? I thought, yes, I have a good memory. That's fine. I remember everything I read when I was at school. He even says that he had a traumatic experience when he was in school, and he kept remembering this as an adult. So don't blame me. I'm just quoting the pagans, and I'm not reading them again. So what my research tried to do, when I tried to do it, was to investigate if it was possible to read in Jerome a theory of intertextuality with the classics. And because he never denied with such intensity like other authors did, and he kept quoting them. So reading Jerome works, I realized that he was developing an instrumental theory of intertextuality. That he is a Christian. He evolved from what he was doing before, but he was he could still use the classics as a tool for pointing out the Christian truths. So I think this is the next slide, if you can see it, when Jerome discusses about this is the moment where Rufino said that Jerome never honored his vow, and Jerome said, well, that was dreaming. That was not true. And I think the next slide, maybe, that's the one. He used an argument that it's just an instrumental tool. And he used this image of a captive slave woman. If you can read with me, look at there. It's really interesting. He's discussing about the general. He had in the Deuteronomy commanded by the voice of the Lord that the captured women should have their heads and eyebrows shaved, be completely depiled, have their nails removed, and then they could be taken as companions. Why he surprised then? If I too wish to make the imprisoned mistress of secular wisdom an Israelite, carried away by the grace of their eloquence and the beauty of her limbs. Furthermore, what if I find in someone something dead in her, such as idolatry, voluptuousness, deceit, lust? Take her in the most pure body and give birth with her to mixed race slaves to the Lord Yahweh of hosts. My work increased the family of Christ. My deflowering of another increased the number of my servants. It's really shocking, this metaphor for us nowadays, I think. But in Jerome time, it was a common idea. Look, Jerome is treating the situation like it was in a war. a war between two religions, two ways of seeing the world. And the Christianity won that war. So he's a winner. He can take the defeated as slaves because it has good things on it. It has good aspects. The question is, you have to be able to say what is good and what is bad. And if you can make this distinction, you can use that on your purpose. Because when you are with the God, always under his power. The only question here is if you are able to understand what is good and what is bad, and take the good part in order to work for your religion. And this is an important thing for Jerome in many aspects, because like we were saying about Origen, for example, when Origen was accused as a heretic author, Jerome said that there was no problem at all. He enjoyed parts of Origen works, not him in the whole, not his works completely. So he says it's perfectly common. He says that against Rufinus again. It's perfectly common to say that an author is good for a reason and he's bad for another one. You are only in contradiction when you see the same thing as good and bad at the same time. And what Jerome does with the classics and with Origen tradition, for example, is saying that he can see what is good and what is bad. And he is a good author. Other one maybe doesn't have this ability, but he does have. And he can do that because he's a huge student. He's using that bad part on it, if you can make a comparison with the dream, in a good sense, for promoting good things.
Of course, that is not an easy task when you have to do, like here in this example, with making the choice of literature. Because Plautus, as an example, is just like a woman here described with hair and with the beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is left if you take away from the classical literature everything that is beautiful? I mean, if you strip it down, what would you say Jerome thought is left if you have stripped down the entire literature from what literature was? I mean, is it then just the biblical text that's left? Is it the biblical message? I mean, what is left with pagan literature when it's gone through the filter of Jerome? Or is it more a pretense and a self, let's say, legitimation in order to continue with his language? Because, I mean, take his language. His language is not biblical language.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, when you look at his works, for example, take the last, as far as we know, his homilies on Jeremiah, one of his last works, if not his last work. Mm-hmm. Most of the quotes which he has, the biblical quotes, are not Vulgate quotes.
Mm-hmm.
So what about his stripping down and removing? It is his language. It is his quotes, and so how does he follow through what he claims here?
That's excellent again. Look, I think, or maybe we can think, when I studied the lower genres, comedy mostly in Jerome, I realized something. There is a strong difference between what is a comic verse and a comic writer. Mm-hmm. So in the next slides, we have these situations. Terence, for example. Terence, it's almost a philosopher in Jerome. He's not a comic writer. Mm-hmm. But what Jerome does, trying to answer or to complement your commentary, Professor, the thing here is, when he uses passage from comedy, sometimes it's just style. It's just for like a gift, small gift in the text for those who read it. Other times, we can see the allusions to Terence's comedy as a way of moralizing. And Terence as a moralizer, it's an important thing here. So what I try to show is that Jerome can compare himself sometimes to Terence. Not any comic writer. Jerome is not that fond of to Plautus, for example. He loves Terence. He uses Plautus, and sometimes he can compare himself to Terence. And that's because Terence had a strong tradition around him, saying that he's a serious author, a great author, a philosophical writer. And he does this comparison. But if Jerome can be compared to Terence, the comic writer, his rivals can be compared to Terence's rivals or to Terence's characters. So the idea here is that you can create an intertextual space between Jerome's writers and comedy, classical comedy. And people in German times are like bad actors or bad characters. So he uses mostly in comedy. The style here is not the most important, but the allusion to a comic scenario, it's what count the most, because he's trying to say that his rivals are inferior to him, and so he kind of shows that he's a creator of an universe, a reality, and that the other persons, his rivals, are kind of lost and try making bad behaviors. The audience, the readers, are watching that situation and saying that they don't want or they shouldn't want to be like that. So there's one option. Not always you have to have a connection with the beauty of the rhetorical way of thinking. Sometimes you can even think that the word can be a stage, like Shakespeare wrote in As You Like It. The word is a stage. And I don't want to be a comic actor. Or that's what Jerome creates for this comparison. Instrumental. Yeah?
Thanks. That's a great comment. I mean, that he creates his own stage and also his own world. Yeah, probably which hasn't been shared by too many people at the time, but incrementally.
I think basically, Marcello, the biggest thing we've come to the conclusion of in this hour is that we've got to have you on again. Basically, is where we've come to, because I know that Mark is brimming with questions because he loves some of these topics, and Marcus has a question that he's already messaged me and wants to ask you, but for the sake of the view time, I think that an hour and 10 minutes is probably plenty for all of you at home to consume. But do not panic. I'm sure, Marcello, if you're amenable, you must come on for another hour and engage this more, because we never even got into Pelagius and our Marcion and Paul and all these other sorts of things. So we've got so much more to discuss. Marcello, do you want to give just a quick final word on any books you have or anything you want to plug, any of your social medias, anything like that people can follow you on or find out about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, my book is in Portuguese nowadays. Maybe I can work on a translation. I have a book on Terence, and I'm writing a second book about Terence in Jerome. But to find me and to contact me, I'm always available to anyone. You can find me as Marcello Zanfra, my name, in Google Academia, where I put when I post my papers, my research, or in Instagram, for example, in Facebook. But mostly I think I'm available for discussions, for indications. Just write me. I'm available all the time. I hope I can finish my book in no long time and translate it to English to make this more spread wide. So I think Marcello Zanfra in social media, and my mail I can leave it so you can write me. You have, right, Jack?
Yes, I'll put any links I have down in the description below for people to go if you want to contact Marcello.
Sure.
Well,
Right.
we'll have you on again. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful, and I've just sat here and absorbed a period that I am not particularly well versed in, and it's just been such a pleasure. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for sticking with us. Please do remember to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye bye.